Hello everyone, welcome back to Dark Knight Tales. Before we dive in, please show your support, give this video a like and be sure to subscribe and click the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. So let's get started. The first story. My son told me what my husband does when I am not home. Hank, can you run down to the basement and fetch me some more flour? I asked my son, who had just come downstairs for breakfast. He plopped down onto one of the kitchen chairs and shook his little head. No, he muttered, I can't. I craned my neck to look at him from the pancake mix bubbling on the stove. He seemed fidgety and pale, not at all like his usual self. Why not? He stared at me, his eyes wide. There are ghosts in the basement, Mum. Oh, don't be silly, I chuckled. Ghosts aren't real, sweetheart. Or even if they are, they live in very old, abandoned houses, much older than ours. Hank was silent, watching me as I poked at the batter in the pan. That's not true, is it? His voice was earnest and eerily calm, sending chills crawling up my spine. Of course, it's true. I assured him. Think about it. What is a ghost? Hank thought for a moment. Someone who's dead? I nodded. Exactly. And no one has died in our house. We bought it brand new last year, remember? So, we can't have ghosts. How do you know? My heart skipped a beat and I turned to look at him again. For a 7-year-old, Hank was an incredibly deep thinker, a quality that had the capacity both to impress and to unnerve. How do I know what? How do you know that no one has died in our house? I tapped the spatula on the edge of the pan, trying to gather my scattered thoughts. Well, wouldn't we know if anyone had? Hey, darling, could you run down and get that flour, please? These pancakes are breaking apart. There was a pause. No, Mum. I sighed impatiently. Hank, your dad's downstairs, the lights will be on. Go on, there's no ghost, trust me. But Hank sat there, kicking his legs under the table, visibly uncomfortable. This had never been a problem in the past, and I couldn't think of any reason for it, aside from some silly horror story his friends might have told him at school. Look, how about I call Dad to come get you? I said, making my way towards the basement door, though. No, Mom, don't. Hank jumped to his feet, dashing after me and gripping the hem of my apron. Don't call Dad. Why? His eyes welled up with tears. I don't like him. I stared at him, taken aback. You don't like him? Why? He's a bad person. What? How can you say such a thing? He stuck out his bottom lip. He's very angry. He's not angry, sweetheart. What makes you say that? Well, Hank sounded hesitant. Yesterday, after school, I went down to the basement to ask for some help with the pasta, and he was yelling at the lady. And then he hit her. I froze. What pasta? What lady? He hid his face in my apron and shook his head. I don't know. I put my hands on his shoulders and kneeled in front of him. Hank, can you tell me what happened? My husband was a stay-at-home dad and normally spent his time tinkering in the garage. His only responsibilities were keeping the house tidy and taking care of Hank after school. I always worked late and usually came home long after my son went to bed. Dad always has a new lady in the basement when I come home from school. I'm not allowed to go down there, but I hear them. He says I have to get my own dinner, but last night I forgot to turn off the stove and some water got on my arm. He pulled up his right sleeve, revealing a large area of scorched skin on his forearm. I stared at it, and then at my son in bewilderment, my throat closing up. And then I went downstairs to tell Dad, but he was busy with the lady. He got really angry when he saw me. I didn't know what to say. My heart was thumping fast in my chest, making me feel lightheaded. What happened to the lady, Hank? I whispered. He wet his lips. I don't. She lives in the basement now. They all do. My blood ran cold. Stay here. I'm going to talk to your father. No. Hank grabbed my sleeve. You can't go, Mom. I have to, baby. Don't worry, the ghosts won't get me. I just need to find out what's going on. No, you can't go, he kept repeating, frantically tugging at my blouse. Dad said you're not supposed to know about last night. I stared at him. What? This is important, Hank. Your father is supposed to be taking care of you." Hank crumpled to the floor, burying his face in his little hands. "I'm afraid," he sniffled, "I'm afraid that if you tell him, he'll make me return to my grave." The second story. I go dumpster diving, and I found something strange that shouldn't exist. I started dumpster diving about 6 months ago. It started as a hobby, and I picked up some cool shit, but the cooler the SHT I picked up the more obsessed I got, and after a while it became an impulse I couldn't ignore. I haven't worked in a while, and my first big find all those months ago was around the back of a pizza place. I didn't have money for groceries and someone told me that undelivered pizzas were just tossed away, and that night my stomach made me check the theory out. The person who had imparted this information hadn't been wrong, and I scored 3 perfect pizzas that night, untouched and still in the box, that I took home and gorged myself until I felt sick. After that, I kind of made it a habit between job searches to check out the dumpsters behind restaurants and grocery stores. Before long, I had a pretty steady routine set up that meant I didn't need to go to food banks anymore, and if I found more than I needed I'd distribute it amongst the homeless shelters and food banks in my town. It made sense that after finding necessities, I would begin looking for luxuries. There is so much waste out there, I can't even begin to describe it. I started checking the backs of pharmacies and clothing stores, and I found makeup, home decor, and fashion items that might not be in perfect condition but were still usable. I managed to pick up decorations for my niece's birthday party, find gifts for Christmas, and even furnish my house with throws and cushions and curtains. It isn't all candles and party plates though. You can find the best and worst of humanity whilst dumpster diving. I quickly learned which places were sympathetic, and which places weren't. Some employees would carefully place undamaged items and food aside from the rest of the waste, just so people like me could find it. Other places poured bleach over food, or slashed clothing so it couldn't be worn. I got manhandled by some pretty unpleasant security guards a couple of times, one specifically hired to deter fortune hunters. I've made some pretty unusual discoveries too. The most heartbreaking ones still haunt me. I found a homeless man sleeping in one once. I didn't see him at first. He'd pulled piles of garbage sacks over him to keep warm, and I woke him with my rummaging. Scared the SHT out of me when he sat up, but I'd had a good haul that night and once I'd calmed down I got some food and blankets from my car for him. It wasn't much, but it was all I could do. Another time I ripped open a plastic sack and found a pile of newborn kittens inside. 5 of them. One was still alive but its siblings had died, and I took it home to try and nurse it back to health. It didn't survive the night. That fucked me up for a while, and I didn't go scavenging for a couple of weeks. I buried all 5 kittens in my back garden, even made a little headstone for them. I couldn't just leave them there to rot. After a while, I got an accomplice, an older niece of mine who liked to hang out with me. She loved looking over my halls every day and begged to be allowed to accompany me, and after a while I let her. She was with me when I found the baby. It was such a normal night. Looking back, I'd found a huge batch of carefully wrapped bread behind a sympathetic bakery, and some discarded perfume samples that were pretty much full behind a department store. So there were no omens, no warnings, that my life was about to change. We heard a strange noise coming from a dumpster behind a supermarket. A mewling sound that spurred me into action. I was thinking of the kittens, all 5 of them lined up beneath the grass of my back garden, and I threw the lid of the dumpster up with such force it rebounded and closed again. With my niece holding the lid up, I abandoned any caution and climbed inside. It was mostly empty. Meaning it had probably been emptied that day, so anything inside had to be recent. That comforted me somewhat. The noise I'd heard at first was accompanied by a frantic rustling, and it took me mere seconds to find out where it was coming from. A plastic bag bound into a tight cylinder with duct tape, only the top and the bottom left untapped. I had started to carry a flashlight with me for my nighttime expeditions, and shone the beam to illuminate the thrashing parcel. The top was wiggling from side to side, the bottom flexing in twin staccato bursts. The kittens had been bad, but this was much worse. I knew what was in there, and for a second I couldn't move for the horror I felt. I had a box cutter with me, but I didn't even get it out of my pocket. I was too scared I might cut what was inside. So I tucked my flashlight under my chin and used my bare hands, focusing on the top of the bag first. I couldn't process that right then, so I didn't. I just carried on shredding the plastic. My niece was peering over the edge of the dumpster, and once the head was free I lifted the little plastic bundle up. It was a solid weight, heavier than I'd expected, but I hadn't held a baby in a long time. "It's a baby," I told my niece, and heard her answering gasp. "Oh my God. No way. Who would do that?" I didn't bother to answer. People could be shit. The kittens had already shown me. Instead, I held the baby up for my niece to take. "Grab it," I told her. "I need both hands to climb out." Now that the initial panic was over, the smell of the dumpster filtered into my senses. It smelled like rotting vegetables and sour milk, and I gagged as I extended my arms. Sour spit filled my mouth and I knew if I didn't get out soon I would puke. My niece started to take the baby from me, as I retched, my eyes watering, but just as I was about to let go I felt the whole weight sag back into my hands. "No," she moaned. "I can't take it." I sputtered, gagging. "I need to get out." "No, it's. I spat over my shoulder, a thin drool I couldn't have swallowed under any circumstances. My niece would have been no help, I know that now. I might have puked myself into unconsciousness, rolling round in the filth of rotten food. But somehow, the reek propelled me up and out. Dizzy and disgusted, I launched myself over the edge of the foul dumpster, the lid scraping my already sore head, then my back, and I fell headfirst onto the concrete below, gulping in fresh air even as I passed out. When I came to, it was dark, but that was because my niece was blocking out the light with her head. I thought, but didn't say. Using my bruised hands, I pushed her away and forced myself to sit up. "Stop sniveling, where is it?" I demanded. She didn't answer with words, just pointed with a shaking hand before putting both hands over her face. "Don't touch it," she said. "It's all fucked up." I had no patience for her. Of course it was fucked up, it had been thrown into a dumpster in a makeshift plastic shroud by someone who deserved to be crucified. I managed to stand, my legs wobbling and my knees sagging. The little parcel I had fought for was lying on the bare concrete some feet away, still taped up, and those weird little muffled sounds were still being emitted. I staggered over, falling onto my knees next to it, and for the first time I saw what my niece meant. The baby was all fucked up. But not by being thrown away like so much garbage. Its head was huge, bulbous, the skin a mottled gray and threaded all over with blue veins. I could see them pulsing in the meager light. But that wasn't the worst thing. It had no face. Where a face should be was just a blank mask of skin, with indents and swells where eyes, nose and mouth would have been. Face-shaped, but not a face. I could have been repulsed, I suppose. Could have felt the same disgust as my niece apparently felt. But I couldn't feel that. It was a baby, not responsible for its appearance, brought into this world only to be rejected. I picked it up, supporting the sagging weight of its oversized head in the crook of my arm. My niece was moaning behind me, but I couldn't feel much sympathy. I remembered holding her as a baby, cradling her squirming little body against me. Her face had been bright pink, her scalp flaky, and her ears too big. That hadn't deterred me then, and this baby didn't deter me now. "Poor baby," I said, and it might have been my imagination but I felt the baby's struggles lessen, and the strangled noises it made grow quiet. How could it hear? I wondered, and inspected the sides of its head. There were little fleshy nubs there, slightly pointed, but sealed over. It whimpered, and this time I wondered, how can it breathe? How can it make noises? It was the first sensible thing she had said. "Yes. This baby needs medical care," I began, but she interrupted me. "Not for that thing. Your head." My eyes has been stinging since I'd regained consciousness, but I had barely noticed, and it was only when she mentioned my head that I realized my head was bleeding. Blood was running into my eyes, dripping down my face, but I didn't have time for that. I shook my head, making me giddy, and it was a little more violent than I intended. "Don't worry about me," I said. "This baby, I took another step towards her, feeling helpless. She was still on the ground, but she leaned back as I approached, crawling like a crab away from me and the pathetic burden I held. "Don't," she said, "I don't want to." The baby made one of its snuffling, strangled meals again, and my knees shuddered. "Just kill it," she moaned. "Kill it." I couldn't speak. I was outraged by her callousness, and stupefied by her ignorance. I shook my head again. And this time I noticed that drops of my blood had fallen on the place where the baby's face should have been. I went to wipe it off with my sleeve, but before I could I noticed something very strange. The blood disappeared. Not like it had run off, but more like it was absorbed, and the noise the baby made now was calmer, somehow. Satisfied. Ignoring my niece, I raised one hand and dipped my fingers onto the blood still dribbling from my head wound. I was curious. I placed my bloodied fingers where I judged the baby's mouth should be, and felt an odd sensation, something like suction, although there was nothing there that could feasibly suck. When I took my hand away, my fingers were clean. Spotless. Strange, I thought. My niece was getting to her feet. I noticed her, at the edge of my vision, something that wasn't important but was also mildly annoying. She was backing away from me. "Kill it," she said again. "It shouldn't be alive." I agreed on that last part. It shouldn't be alive. But it was, and I would do everything I could to make sure it stayed alive. "FCK off," I told her. My voice sounded far away, and echoey, as though I was hearing it shouted from the end of a tunnel. "FCK off, or I'll kill you," I heard myself say. I paddled my fingers in my head wound again and transferred the blood to the baby's non-existent mouth. I felt the pull in my fingertips, a sensation that traveled all along my arm, into my shoulder, and into my chest where it seemed to tug at my heart. My niece said something then, something I didn't hear, and I said something back that I don't remember. Whatever it was, she fled. Ran away into the night and left us in peace. It's a good job she did. I don't know what I might have done. They might have found her body in the dumpster the next time it was emptied, a replacement for the little sacrifice I held in my arms. Once she had gone, and once I'd fed the baby till it was sated, I returned to my car and laid my little bundle on the back seat. It was still taped up, swaddled in plastic, and I didn't like that. I used my pocket knife very carefully, stripping away lengths of tape until it was free, then I wrapped it in a blanket. The way a baby should be swaddled. It's worth mentioning that the rest of the baby's body was pretty much the same as its head, pale and discolored, but blank. Whilst it was of a normal size and proportions, there were no indications of any gender. It was smooth like a Barbie doll. Perfect and neat. And that made a twisted kind of sense. I wouldn't need anything for this baby apart from clothes to warm its chilly little body. No bottles, no diapers. Just a supply of what it seemed to need, and whilst I have plenty of that, I know I can't sustain a regular supply without leaving the baby motherless. So I will have to find it elsewhere. It's amazing what you can find in dumpsters. The third story. Don't speak to the wandering man. The final walkthrough had been going great until it was said. We were standing by the barn away from the realtors, my husband and I, along with the couple we were purchasing the property from, Ralph and Marie. I know how it sounds. You'll think I have a screw loose until you see him yourself. The old man smiled awkwardly. Just don't speak to the wandering man. It sounds alarming, but he never gave us any trouble. Ralph looked at his wife and she nodded quickly. Never any trouble. And we've been seeing him less and less, Marie said. When was the last time we even saw him, honey? Oh, Ralph pawed his beard. I'd say 3.5 years now. And it had been another 2 before that. I was a little disturbed, but I could tell my husband, Howard, was getting annoyed. What are you talking about? Some kind of trespasser? He said, frowning. Look, we're giving you a good deal on this place because it wouldn't feel right making a fortune selling it with these circumstances. You're safe here, and that's what matters. But there's a man that wanders these woods. Ralph stared at us gravely. And he has for some 100 years. Howard sighed obnoxiously and stared at the husband and wife each in turn with disappointment. Anything else we should know? Ghosts in the attic? Blood leaking from the walls? The couple looked at each other, embarrassed. I know it's hard to believe when we're talking like this, but we're normal folks. We're just giving you a heads up. I'll tell you what, forget this conversation until you see him. I'm a little sorry I said anything, I just wanted to save you from a fright. Will do. Howard looked at me and didn't care to hide his growing disdain. The thing was, I liked Ralph. When we drove all the way from Boston to remote Maine to tour the property, Ralph actually looked at me as he described where he felled his trees for firewood and explained how the hydraulic log splitter worked. Most of the men who owned the properties we had toured only spoke to my husband when it came to anything related to farm work. I was the ghost. Howard and I had finally reached the end of a brutal buying process to purchase our homestead in northern New England, and I could see why Howard was angry. There were no such things as ghosts to him. Now our brand new home had some trespasser he'd be worried about. "Come on, Jody," said Howard. He was already walking back to the house. I watched him over my shoulder but stayed still. I suppose I was more prone to believe in the supernatural. Ralph took off his ball cap and rubbed his bald spot. "I'm sorry. We didn't really know how to tell you this. We even thought about rehearsing." He laughed uncomfortably. "But I'm deadly serious," he sighed, as if sick of coming across as a madman. "When you see him, don't speak to him. You can say hello, he won't respond to that. But if you say anything else..." Ralph stared fearfully into the distance as if looking upon the past. "Well, don't. Just ignore him, and be sure to tell him, too." Ralph pointed past me to my husband's back. I nodded. Their sincerity made me want to believe them. They seemed like regular people who understood they were coming across as crazy and were ashamed of it. "Thank you too, really." I shook their hands and they both smiled, relieved to be treated normally. I almost thought we were never going to find a place. Well, I don't think we could have found a lovelier couple to sell it to. Across the lawn from the barn, we could see the lake. It was autumn then, and the three of us were quiet as we watched a breeze send a brigade of birch leaves spinning into the cold water. Ralph closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "And welcome," he extended his arms. "Welcome to heaven on earth." We settled in fast. While I had a marketing job that was fully remote, Howard's job was hybrid. Every week or so he would have to commute to Bangor to catch a connecting flight at Boston Logan, where he'd be ferried to some project around the country. He worked in engineering consultancy, and while I liked my job, he loved his. He said he didn't mind the extra commute, and I didn't mind being left alone in a house where the nearest neighbor was a mile away. Getting fast enough internet to work from the woods was the biggest hurdle, but after shelling out $200 a month for satellite we seemed set. I suppose we weren't your average couple who moved from the city to the middle of nowhere. But it made sense. We loved nature and self-sufficiency and didn't utilize the amenities of the city. Neither of us had friends that we saw often anymore, and when it came to family, the further away they were the better. Maybe there were signs I hadn't seen before, but it was a month after we moved in that I first noticed something was off. It was late, 11 p.m. or so, and I sat alone by a bonfire on the lake shore. Howard already asleep inside, being the early to bed, early to rise type. I brought my wine to my lips and paused mid-sip. There, a half-mile away on the far side of the lake, a figure was strolling the shore. It was dark, but by the starlight I was sure it was a person. I leaned forward and frowned. There were 2 other homes on the lake, but the shoreline was largely undeveloped and the woods that lined the lake were impenetrable with thick pine and aspen. Was this him? The harmless wandering man? I changed my sip to a swig and considered. Ralph had said he'd last seen him years ago, and I thought it strange he should make an appearance so soon. Then again, maybe this man only wandered at night? And Ralph and Marie were old. It was likely they couldn't see very far in the dark, and how often did they sit outside at this hour? I had been having bonfires nearly nightly. It was one of the big reasons I'd moved out to the rural woods. You see, when I was camping as a girl, I developed a kind of addiction. An addiction to that sensation brought by the stars and the silence and the lonely vacuum of visible space. Maybe you've felt it too, sitting alone at night, far from civilization, underneath stars as thick as smoke. We're faced with a nauseating sense of our insignificance. It's at night with the universe in sight, and for scale that we can see we're barely bigger than bacteria, with lives just as brief and legacies just as remembered. I couldn't get enough of it. Of the oneness. Of the vulnerability that comes under the vault. Only stepping inside would break the trance. Then when I woke in the morning, I'd wonder how I ever felt so small, smiling in the sunshine, assured and confident in the enormity of myself. But I had a different sensation that night. The feeling of an animal being watched. The feeling of prey. Something was wrong with how he walked, but it took me a minute to realize what it was. His steps never paused or wavered. The lake shore was not a smooth apron of rock. It was strewn with big branches of driftwood and boulders of basalt. If you were to walk it, you'd go slow as you considered your every step. I shivered then. In another few minutes he was difficult to see, and then he turned into the wood line and disappeared into the pines entirely. You're safe here. I remember Ralph saying. Just don't speak to him. I was not afraid of the dark, and I wasn't going to let myself be spooked away from doing what I loved on my own property. I kept having bonfires at night, while I was determined to not let this man ruin my rural evenings. I admit I rarely took my eyes from the opposite shore. It was a few weeks later and beginning to get cold enough to snow when I thoroughly began to question the safety of the woods where we lived. I'd finished splitting a quarter cord by hand and was bent breathing while palming my knees when I noticed it. We had an ancient birch tree just past the woodshed, and its removal was on the to-do list as it sat dying with its bark peeling off in scrolls. But sticking out just beneath a bit of bark something caught my eye. I squinted and walked over. With a finger I pushed the bark back. There was a carving. I frowned. A carving of me. Of my face. It was a crude carving, as if done with a fingernail, but still I smiled when I saw it. My birthday was coming up and I figured Howard had to be behind it. He was good at drawing, but I had never heard of him carving anything. The alarm bells weren't ringing then. I went inside to find him and wrapped my arms around his shoulders as he sat at his computer. I'm very sorry. I found your surprise, I said. But you're very sweet. I kissed his cheek and he smiled. What are you talking about? I found your carving out there while chopping wood. He frowned and I didn't need to hear what he said next to know. I never carved anything. Where? My blood ran cold, and I took my arms away from his shoulders. On the dead birch. He started to stand. What's it a carving of? The two of us stood in the cold and stared at the tree. This is a joke, right? He pointed and looked at me and laughed. Did you do this? No, Howard. I didn't carve it. I mean, it's not very flattering, no offense. Why is this something to joke about to you? Ah, he said and clacked his tongue. You think this must be the wandering man? The one in the woods that cookie old couple warned us about? Howard. No, it's okay. I'll handle it. I think I'll give old Ralph a call. He started walking away. Howard. What? I know you're not going to take me seriously, but I've seen someone on the lake shore, late at night. You're right. I'm not going to take you seriously. So why tell me that SHT in the first place? I know what those people said sounded strange, but my gut didn't tell me they were lying. Guess what? I don't think they were lying either. But they believed crap like that and then tried to scare us the second we finally found a home. They're rude people, Jody. Or at least not right in the head. And now this, he pointed at the tree. What, did they pull a picture of you off the internet and carve this here? I don't think so. Well, who did then? Things weren't the same after that. Both between me and Howard and how I felt on the property. Howard is a sweet man, but I could tell my belief in the supernatural bothered him. Deep down it probably scared him. He was rarely impatient and condescending to me and I was frustrated, too. We couldn't afford to just try and sell this place and leave. This was our home, and I didn't want to be afraid here either. That same Sunday I was watching television late after Howard had gone to bed. It was a perfect night for another fire, clear and cool, but for first time since we'd moved, I couldn't bring myself to sit outside alone. In fact, I'd locked the doors for the first time, and while Howard had noticed, I could tell he was relieved I'd done so and said nothing. I was developing the beginnings of paranoid habits. Every hour or so I would look out the windows. Not just the front ones either. I'd go into the kitchen, the den, the pantry just to stare into the night. On my last round of looking out the windows that night, I turned from the diamond panes of the front door to head up to bed, but plus, I had seen something. I turned back slowly. Just beyond the black where the security light on our garage faded, a man was standing at the edge of the dark. I gasped. My first instinct was to open the door and yell, but then I remembered Ralph's warning. I threw myself up the stairs and went into our bedroom and shook Howard's foot to wake him. "Howard. I think there's someone outside. Please just come see." He sighed and rolled so his feet were on the floor. "Okay. For you." I stood on the stairs while he leaned to look out the window glass in the door. "I don't see anything." He turned back to me, just at the edge of the light. I stepped past him and put my eye to the glass. But there was nothing there. My shoulders sank. "He was right there," I said quietly, defeated. "Jody, I'm sorry I was snappy before, but this is what I'm so frustrated about. Those people put a creepy idea in your head and now you're seeing what you want to see." I saw someone. "I'll order a Ring doorbell tomorrow. You can put up a whole set of security cameras if you want. This is our home. We need to feel safe here. I'll do whatever it takes for you to feel that way." He tried to lay a hand on my shoulder, but I flinched away and stayed staring at the window while he went back upstairs to bed. I did order security cameras. Enough for a cartel compound. Camera on the barn. Camera on the garage. Infrared camera to point across the lake. I was going to feel safe here. Howard was right about that. It was our home. I had two. It cost an entire paycheck but was worth the peace of mind. However, it brought the opposite. I set up multiple monitors, moved in the coffee maker, and turned my little office into a war room. The first few nights there was nothing. Then the fourth night, at 2 in the morning, I saw something walking the perimeter of the property. I perked up, splashing my coffee in its cup. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, yes, yes." I was more elated than scared. I finally had this thing. Or so I thought. When I played back the footage, I cursed. The figure was just out of range of the cameras. I should have shelled out more and bought only infrared. The lights on the garage and barn weren't going to be bright enough. I still didn't share anything with Howard. While I could make out what I thought was a face and shoulder of this man walking, I knew it wouldn't be enough to convince him. Howard didn't want to believe. The footage would have to perfect. When I first got the cameras, I forsook sleep and let my marketing work slip. I had to capture an image of this thing. I had nearly become nocturnal and my sleep deprivation began to scare me just as much as whatever was in those woods. I left the oven on and open, forgot my husband was home, ran the coffee maker without the pot in it. I was a mess and I had to hit the brakes. Instead of staying up and watching live, I decided I'd fast forward the footage when I had time the next day. That night I planned to resume my regular sleep schedule. It was around 11 p.m. when I went upstairs, and I jumped when I opened the bedroom door. Howard was mummied in the sheets. The entire long length of him was draped skin-tight from head to toe. I raced over to him but heard his steady breathing and relaxed. I thought that thing had killed him. I was losing it, I realized. I was really losing it. I took 2 Benadryl and slipped into bed. Miraculously, I slept and later woke in a fright to the bedroom door closing, but it was 4 a.m. and I realized Howard was already up to go for a run. I tossed and turned but couldn't fall back to sleep. The cameras called to me like a siren song. I threw the sheets off me and went downstairs. The house was empty. Howard's running sneakers weren't on the shoe shelf and I knew I'd have ample time to check the footage without looking like a lunatic. I sat in my chair but before I could rewind the footage I froze. On the live screen, the man was staring at the front of the house. As still as a street performer and more in view than he'd ever been. His clothes were thick and woolen, but his face was hidden from view. "FCK," I said aloud, suddenly realizing he was outside with this thing. "Howard." Luckily, he brought his phone to listen to music when he ran, and I dialed him immediately. He answered on one of the later rings. "Jody? What's going on?" "Howard," I exhaled. "Thank Christ. That thing. That man is staring at the house right now." "What? Are you safe?" "Jody, it's 4 in the morning. There's no one outside, go back to bed." I'm telling you. I have him on camera this time. Come back, or no. Wait until it's light out. Don't come back until daylight." He paused. "I think you need to go stay with your parents." "I'm safe, I'm inside, just get back here safely when you can." "Jody," his voice was cautious now, as if I were something fragile that could be broken. "I'm out of town on a project outside of Dallas right now, remember? Until Friday?" I froze in terror as I stared at that thing on the screen. "Then who was in our bed tonight?" "What?" I let the phone fall to my lap. Howard was yelling loud enough for me to still hear, yelling about getting out of the house, but I couldn't speak anymore. It hadn't been Howard. It was the shape of that thing that I had seen under the sheets before bed. I pictured it stare at me as I slept. I hung up and walked in a trance to the door. It was unlocked. I had sworn I'd locked it. I clenched my teeth in anger and threw it open. I stared at the man, and instead of just looking at the house, he was now staring back at me. "What do you want with me?" I shrieked horribly. "Leave me alone, you creep. You hear me? Leave me alone." His head began to tilt to one shoulder. Tilting too far. "Oh God," I whispered. "Oh God." I'd spoken to this thing. I'd broken the only rule. I slammed the door and leaned my back against it. Suddenly there was a horrible howling that morphed into sobs. The sobs of a grown man crying in the night. But there was something wrong with the noise. It was as if he were only mimicking emotion. Like it didn't know what cries were supposed to sound like. Ralph had given me his number and I fumbled my phone trying to find his contact. As it rang, I managed to turn towards the sound. The crying continued, but that thing was walking calmly towards the house. Its features were wrong. Its legs too long. Its hands too big. Suddenly I saw its eyes the size of tea saucers. It smiled monstrously wide, but the sobs continued. "Hello?" came a confused voice from the other line. "Ralph. It's Jody. Jody Cope. I bought your property." "It's a bit early, Jody." "That thing," I stuttered. "The man walking in the woods. He drew a picture of me. He came into my house. He's been watching me and now I talk to him." "Oh dear," I heard him stretch. "Okay, are your doors locked?" "Uh-huh." "You said it drew a picture?" "It carved my face into a tree." "Okay," he sighed. "I'm sorry, I don't know what to tell you. It ignored me and Marie." "But when you spoke to it, what happened? What's it want?" "When I asked it who it was, it showed me what it really looked like. And I suppose a man isn't quite the word for it." "But what's it want?" I screamed and braved another look out the window. It was even closer now, just a few feet from the door. I ran into the living room. "I don't know," said Ralph. "I really don't. I'm sorry to say this but..." He paused, and my heart leapt as 3 soft knocks sounded on the door. "It sounds like he likes you." If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.